Welcome to The Past People, where I will talk about the people of the past.
Early modern Europe is famous for its acts of violence, bloody executions, mutilations, and torture, and with it came wars, rebellions, and riots. The authorities took great pleasure in finding the most violent form of punishment and subjecting the criminals to it. An example of this is the punishment of low-class criminals in society by authorities. They would purposely humiliate and mutilate them before their execution to make the greatest impact to them and their families. This was true in Renaissance Venice. A certain mutilation would reflect the crime so that the crowds of people could easily recognize the alleged offense. Those that stole had their hands chopped off at the place the crime took place. They would then be marched through the streets while the authorities shouted out the crime they had committed to by bystanders. Witches were burned at the stake in the hope to purify them. Fire cleansed the soul when a confession was given. This is why convicted witches are often made to recite their confessions beforehand. Those that were baptized as infants and chose to have another second baptism as adults didn't count, so they suffered a third baptism when they were drowned. This was true of Jad of Leyden, who was attached to a pole, had his body pierced with hot tongs and his tongue ripped out, had a burning dagger lunged into his chest before being hung in a gibbet alongside other Anabaptists, where the gibbets would hang until the 20th century. These gibbets were displayed for lengthy periods of time to punish the victim and the victim's family. These bodies were also given to medical colleges for dissection, which was against many religions at the time, further disturbing the family. Criminals were stripped of their rights as well as their clothes. They were often whipped and tortured before their execution as a sick power play from the authorities. People were encouraged to attend and participate in these public executions or risk being accused themselves. When a priest was hung for treason by his foot for a full day, the bystanders were encouraged to participate in stoning the priest to death. A common display during the Inquisition was to reenact the Day of Judgement. The criminal would be marched through the town in a robe holding a taper candle as a sign of their lack of faith. After the long march, their fate was announced to the bystanders and the ultimate punishments were carried out. Hanging was the most common form of punishment. It allowed the crowd to be entertained the longest as they could watch the criminal flail about before watching them slowly lose consciousness and control of their bowels on the floor. Another method of execution was to be broken on the Catherine wheel, a wooden wagon wheel where the criminal would be forced to lay on, where he would then have his bones broken and limbs bludgeoned during beatings with iron bars before slowly dying painfully. Those that killed kings were hung, drawn and quartered for the crime of treason. The full punishment for a traitor included several steps. They would be drawn for treason, hanged for homicide, disemboweled for sacrilege, and beheaded and quartered by horses for plotting the king's death. Their death was extended to emphasize the particularly awful nature of the crime. When Francois Ravaillac succeeded in assassinating the French King Henry in 1610, he had his skin mutilated with molten lead and oil before being ripped apart by 4 horses that were pulled in different directions. Low-class prisoners seemed to have the most drawn-out punishments with maximum pain, and those that were noble mostly avoided public dismemberments or mutilation before execution. Instead, they would often meet the guillotine, and this was seen more fitting of their status. The French Revolution reflected the height of violence and anger in society. This is where the guillotine emerged as a symbol of the revolution. It was advocated to use in 1789 by the medical doctor and member of the Revolutionary National Assembly, Joseph-Guillotin. He persuaded society that it was a quick and painless means of execution in comparison to beheading, where it was often feared that the headsman would miss and multiple swings of the axe would be needed, prolonging the suffering of the accused. The guillotine removed the human error from the equation and made executions instantaneous, but came with less pomp and entertainment. The executions were less exciting for bystanders. A cord would be pulled and the blade would fall. Except for the display of the head to the crowd, there was much less to it than the other forms of execution. Although the execution lacked quality, it made up for it in volume. During the Reign of Terror of the French Revolution, thousands of people were subjected to the guillotine. During this time, many French people were massacred, shot, drowned, or killed by other means. Guillotines were also used and were often in shortage. Some towns had to share guillotines, with its schedules being established to control when a town could use it. At least 40,000 people were killed. 300,000 French people were arrested, 1 in 50. The death toll was even higher for noble families and aristocrats and royals such as Marie Antoinette and King Louis. It is thought that the number of people killed has been greatly underestimated, as vigilantes and self-proclaimed representatives of the Republic are not included. When the Terror was officially declared over in July 1794, the leaders of the Terror were then ironically executed by guillotine, the same system they advocated for, the common people, for so long. Robespierre was one of them. He led France into the Age of Terror and met his fate the same way as many others. He did attempt to commit suicide but ended up with a mangled jaw when he shot himself in the face. He did not die and was therefore marched to the guillotine, where his bandages were ripped off and his head was chopped off. The use of the guillotine was not over when the Terror was declared over. It continued to be used until 1981, when capital punishment was abolished. The last execution in France occurred on September 10th, 1977.
Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.